Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event brought to you by the African Policy Students Association at Georgetown. I would like to thank my board of directors for their help in putting this event together. I would also like to say thank you to my professors, Professor Frank and Professor Shanta, who helped connect us with Dr. Songwe for this event. Finally, I would like to thank the team at the Economic Commission for Africa, Chichi, Mati, and Meseret for their help. At this point, I'll hand over to my fellow board member, Neha, to read the short bio of our guest.
Thank you, Ebele. Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Dr. Songwe. Dr. Vera Songwe is the Undersecretary General of United Nations and Executive Secretary of Economic Commissions of Africa. Upon her appointment, she became the first woman to lead the institution in its 60-year history. As Executive Secretary, Dr. Songwe's reforms have focused on ideas of prosperous Africa and have brought to the fore critical issues of macroeconomic stability, development finance, private sector growth, poverty and inequality, digital transformation, trade, and competitiveness. Recently, she listed as one of Africa's 50 most powerful women by Forbes, named as one of the 100 most influential Africans by Gen Afrish in 2019, 100 most influential Africans by New African Magazine in 2017, and one of the 25 Africans to watch by Financial Times in 2015. Dr. Songwe is acknowledged for her long-standing track record of providing policy advice and her wealth of experience in delivering developing results for Africa. She has written extensively on development and economic issues, including on debt, infrastructure development, fiscal and governance issues. She's well published and contributes to the development debate across a broad spectrum of platforms, including in the Financial Times. Prior to Economic Commissions for Africa, she held a number of senior leadership roles with International Finance Corporation and World Bank. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Songwe for her remarks. Welcome, Dr. Songwe.
Can you hear me?
We can now, yeah.
Okay, it was telling me the host is not allowing my voice to go on mute. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I don't know where you are. I know we're connecting through Washington, GW University, so it should be early afternoon for those who are in Washington. And for those of us who are on the continent, it's evening. Thank you very much. Let me first of all start by saying good evening to the board of directors. I would just say good evening to everybody that was introduced before. Of course, I'm here because of the sins of one of your professors, Professor Shanta Devarajan, who's a very good friend and a former colleague of mine. And so it's always a pleasure when Shanta asks to do something. So he flatters you well, let's put it that way. So thank you and good evening, Shanta. I can't see you yet on my screen, but hopefully I'll be able to catch a glimpse of you at some point. I thought that maybe rather than make a long series of opening remarks, at least according to the way that Shanta told me this event was going to unfold, we were going to have a conversation. I can give you a little bit of background on where Africa is with COVID and the response, because that's a big part of the conversation. I could also tell you a little bit of sort of what we are doing at the Economic Commission for Africa. But I think what will be more useful maybe for you and for me is really questions and answers. And, you know, what is it that you would like me to say and how would you like to go through this? But let me take just a step back and talk a little bit about, you know, the macroeconomic environment on the continent today, what we're doing on that, and then hopefully we'll open up. I won't do that for very long. We have just released a report, and I think Chichi will put it in the chat box, called Building Forward Better. And that report essentially begins, we thought, you know, we've been in COVID now for 8 months, and a lot of African countries have been quite resilient. And actually the call that I was on just before joining this one was a call with Johnson & Johnson, and the one before was a call with Pfizer. And one of the things we're looking at is to see how we can ensure that Africa gets at least 60% vaccines for 60% of its population when the vaccines become available. There is a conversation around the fact that Africa has been very resilient. We're still trying to understand, and actually on the call with Johnson & Johnson just now, a new suggestion came up about sort of blood types, and then, maybe Africans have a lot of the seropositive, and seropositives apparently seem to be more resilient to the COVID virus. And this is still a work in progress, but it seems to be coming out of Kenya. But what we all expected initially was that, we will have, 300,000 cases, or 3 million cases, 300,000 dead. We're not there. We're at about 1 million cases and somewhere in the order of 74,000 dead, which is a big number. I think when you're in the United States, this number 74,000 looks like, that's what you have in a day in terms of new cases coming up. So it doesn't look that much. But for us, I think it's quite high. But it's nowhere near the predictions that we had in March about what will happen on the continent. However, where we have seen, just devastation is on the economic side. If you take a country like Egypt, for example, with interruptions of the supply chains, almost 15% of Egypt's tax revenue, Egypt's GDP, comes from, trade with the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal essentially just went down, stopped remittances to Egypt. Ended because all of the foreign workers had to come back from particularly the Middle East, were all brought back in, and so there was no more sort of remittances being sent in. The same is true for a lot of our small island states, Seychelles, Cape Verde, Mauritius, and the like. Of course, tourism in places like Kenya, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana just went to a halt as well. And then, of course, we also saw commodity prices crash, right? Because nobody was flying, so nobody was asking for fuel, nobody was driving. So, oil prices started dipping. They're back to around maybe $40, $50. But remember that we, at some point, were living with $100 of oil prices. China's contraction, one of the reasons why Africa did not suffer a severe contraction in 2008, 2009, was that through 2010, China continued to grow. So economies like the African, most of the commodity-based African economies, and even some of the Latin American economies continue to grow because China put in huge stimuluses, and so the economy continued to grow. This was not the case this time. And when China finally decided to put in a stimulus, China then did a lot, and maybe they learned from 2008, 2009, they did a lot of intra sort of local lagging region stimuluses, essentially asking private businesses from the coastal areas of China to invest more in inner China, which has created and resulted in growth. Sometime in June, the Minister of Finance of China said that they were not going to talk about GDP numbers for China, but in September they came out with a 6.7% growth number for China, which means that they're picking back up again. This is not the case for the continent. We were growing at 3.2%. The COVID crisis has taken us down to negative 1.4%. Some parts of the continent, East Africa, may see some pickup in growth again, but we are not seeing that in North Africa. Of course, Morocco has not come out of the COVID crisis. South Africa seems to be maybe going into a second wave, and South Africa was the largest hit. We had the top 5 largest hit countries on the continent being South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, and then Nigeria. So again, some of our big countries were the most hit, and some of our middle income countries. Now, what have we done? We, of course, made a plea to the international community, mostly your neighbors in Washington, the World Bank and the IMF, to see whether we could get some relief. I think immediately the African finance ministers met with the coordination of the Economic Commission for Africa. We asked for a debt suspension initiative. We got that from the G20. It has delivered for Africa so far somewhere between almost $5 billion, I would say 4.9, with the largest going to Angola at $2.6 billion of relief. But also what the IMF did, and they did very well and very quickly, was for the low income countries, 19 of them, the IMF just wrote off all the debts that they had to the IMF. The next thing that we were asking for is what we call the special drawing rights. We haven't gotten it yet, but there is a lot of noise and news that may happen. Essentially, that would allow African countries to be able to purchase foreign goods, because one of the things that has happened is we no longer have foreign currency. If you don't have foreign currency, you really cannot purchase a lot. And finally, the other thing that we're talking about is what do we do with our private sector debt? This crisis is very unlike most crises that have happened on the continent, for the simple fact that a lot of our debt is no longer bilateral Paris Club debt, OECD, you know, our group of friends, former colonial masters. Now we have Chinese debt. We have a lot of Eurobond debt, which is private commercial debt. We have Turkish debt. We have Indian debt. So it's a much wider spread of debt that we have now. Our private sector debt is about $16 billion. That's huge. We need to understand how we can honor that debt. So the Economic Commission for Africa has come up with something called the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which is a way of seeing whether we can buy back some of that debt and then reissue it at much cheaper prices, which will allow then for many more African countries to be able to afford to pay their debt, to remain current, not to go into default, but also to continue to access markets. And then, of course, the G20 last week, for those of you who are following, on Friday, the G20 finance ministers had a meeting. They came up with a new G20 debt framework, and we're working on that to see how we respond to it. We believe that it's a step in the right direction, but that it has a number of drawbacks, which take us back to 1980. And clearly, we don't want to go back to 1980. Our report was called Building Forward Together. So we're looking at how we can restructure that to go forward in a much more green environment. We're hoping that together with, of course, Washington and its institutions, we can do better and more as we work to come out of this COVID crisis. I would stop there and open up for questions. That was 9 minutes. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Songwe. So I'm sorry you got the wrong impression. It is going to be a moderated discussion, so we don't just put you on the spot.
Okay.
Thank
No. I could talk more, but yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us here at Georgetown's MCourt Policy School of Public Policy. So in line with everything that you've said about the COVID, an interesting pattern seems to be that a lot of African countries are currently trying to service a lot of debts, and then they have to also respond to the pandemic. And you also realize that like a lot of these African countries are witnessing slow growth in their economy. So how do you expect countries to balance this going forward? Like, are there projects or implementations or plans the Commission has?
Yes, no, I think that's a very important question. So two things are happening, right? Before the crisis, there are about 54 countries on the continent. Before the crisis, we had 5 countries that were already in debt distress, which means they couldn't essentially pay their interest payments on their debt. That's when we talk about being in debt distress, we're really not talking about your total global debt. We're talking about your ability to honor your principal and interest obligations. So if you look at it a little bit as your mortgage, right? When we say that you can't pay your mortgage, it's not that we say you can't pay the whole, 400,000, 1 million, whatever that the cost of your house is. It's just that you can't pay your mortgage for that month, and which is essentially your principal plus interest. And so we had these 5 countries who could not do that, of which you had Eritrea, Zimbabwe, and South Sudan. So those are 3 countries where essentially they were in arrears, and as we all know, they're sort of countries that have not had a sustained engagement with the international community for a very long time. The 2 important countries in that list are Mozambique and Congo, not Congo DRC, but Congo Republic of Congo. So that's the first 5 category. They were already in trouble. Then we have a category of 10 that were not yet in debt distress, but were at high risk of debt distress. And that includes, of course, Zambia. We had Angola in that list. We had Cameroon, I think, I can't remember, and a couple of other countries in that list of high risk of debt distress. Now, what has happened with the COVID crisis is that those countries that were at high risk of debt distress are in even more distress, because when you have COVID and you have a contraction in your economy, your denominator shrinks. Your numerator stays the same, so the number is much larger, right? And essentially most countries, because as I have just said, the service sector shut down, so you don't have any taxes. So if you are not collecting any taxes, how do you honor your debt? And that's why we came up, the African finance ministers came up with this idea very early in March to say, can we get relief on payment of debt, on the debt service? As in the United States and in many other countries, there was a 6 months relief on paying the mortgage. It's exactly the same concept. It was to say, let's allow you to have some liquidity that you can then use to respond to the COVID crisis. So that's what happened. And as I said, altogether about $4.9 billion came to the continent in terms of, rather than pay your interest payments, use the resources that you had put aside for interest payments to respond to the COVID crisis. Now, at some point, we need to come back to saying, how do we get the revenues back? How do we get the economies growing again so that we can continue, one, to restore growth. The other thing that happened, of course, with the crisis is we lost jobs. And we need to get, particularly for our youth and women, we need to get that going again. And so I think the problem is not so much, and there's a lot of conversation around debt. The problem is not so much whether we're getting into more debt or not. The problem is whether that debt is productive, right? And so I actually argue that now African countries should go out and if they have access to markets, get some debts to ensure that, we can continue to supply energy, that we can improve our roads. We are just about, as a continent, to launch the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. It's a huge investment plan. I call it the sort of the African equivalent of a Marshall Plan, because Africa will be building ports, will be building roads, will be building rails so that we can move these goods around. So there's going to be a huge economic boost. If we contract debt to do that, things which have a high rate of return, then I think it's the right thing. One of the problems the continent has is that, one, a lot of our debt is opaque. There is no transparency, and that's one of the things the G20 framework is now insisting on. We need a lot more transparency. First, on the debt we contract. One of the things that has come out with COVID is, as we at the Economic Commission for Africa work with finance ministers across the continent, we see that even the terms of the debt are so egregious. You wonder why would any minister sign something like that? But the good thing about it is that it's now come out, so we can work on it. And maybe when we have the next crisis, it will be slightly better. So again, the short answer to your question is it's not so much the debt, but it's the rate of return. It's the quality of the investment that you make when you get the debt that allows you to determine whether you want more or not, or whether you should get more or not.
Okay, thank you very much for that. In line with your mention of the free trade agreement, I was wondering, and a couple of us in the community were wondering, how the Commission intends to unify these sectors, because they mentioned 5 key areas: transportation, communication, tourism, financial services, and business services. And we know that a lot of countries have national plans for most of these sectors. And the idea is to make Africa the biggest trade area. So how do you intend to create a unified system across borders that makes it easier for countries to trade with each other?
No, I'm very happy, because when I mentioned the CFTA, I saw a big smile on your face, which means, one, that you're following it, and that's great, but it's also a big project, and we should all be proud of it as Africans when we talk about it. So that was good. I think 3 things. Actually, I spent my day today, almost 2.5 hours with African ministers of trade, essentially talking about the different protocols in the CFTA and the different agreements, and countries, talking about why they think that a particular tariff line will be important or not important for them, what that will impact, how that will impact on their trade. I must say that one of the things that came out of the conversation today, which was very heartening, was a number of countries that said, we know that if we get into the CFTA in the short run, it's going to hurt us, but we think it's a good idea. Or they said, we know that if we get into the CFTA, we may lose, but we don't want. So there was an argument between whether they should have a 7-year transition or 2-year transition. I think we ended up with a 5 or 4-year transition, and everybody was willing to make a little bit of a sacrifice, knowing we may lose something today, but there is the prospect of this much larger market. Now, the Economic Commission for Africa with the NEPAD, the sort of development arm of the African Union, are working on what are the border impediments, what are the things that we need to open. Actually, there's another meeting, there's a lot of trade meetings going on the continent. Today, the sort of technical trade partners were meeting today precisely on the customs unions and how we can harmonize the custom union regimes across the continent. The good thing about it is that when we talk about the CFTA, we're not talking about something that we just started yesterday. The CFTA is a 20-year project, right? And in the last 2-3 years, yes, it's gained a lot of momentum. There's been a lot of work. from ECA, the African Union, and many others, the ITC, and many others who have been working on this support of many partners, the World Bank and all that included. I think one of the things that we're trying to work on now is to see how we start harmonizing customs borders. But SADC already had a harmonized customs agreement. ECO has had one that's 14 countries, SADC is 14. So there you already have 28 countries. And then we had COMESA, which was the SADC and EAC coming together to create COMESA, which is about 21 countries. So there have already been some harmonization processes happening across the continent. Not all of them brought together. And I think this is now what the CFTA will build upon to get to where we want to get to. And that's why we're very hopeful and very excited that we believe we can actually get there, because we are not starting from 0-0. We are building off of, a lot of the work that has been done in the regional economic communities.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Also, to our guests, we would like you to know that if you have questions for Dr. Songwe, feel free to drop them in the chat box. Our next question for you, Dr. Songwe, is we saw this interview of you at the Oxford Business School, and you talked about how in international development, you're interested in creating a bench of, it's kind of like an environment for women who will be equipped to take over, not to take over, but more like to
contribute. It's okay to take over too.
Okay, yeah, to contribute or take over to everything that's happening in the international sphere. And currently with people like Okonjo-Iweala and yourself in Africa, you people are big mentors to people like me who are just coming out of the continent. And so we would like to ask, what are your aspirations and what are your expectations from the next generation? You've been here for over 2 decades. You've seen things change. Where do you think we should focus more, and how do you think we should leverage the opportunities that are there for us?
No, that's a very good question. I think one of the things, I'm fortunate that at the Economic Commission for Africa, we have what we call the Mo Ibrahim Scholars. And so every year we're offered the opportunity to get one young person that comes, and essentially I mentor them, but what they do is they just track, they stay with us and they watch what we're doing, and it's preparing young leaders. And in the 3 years that I've been at the Economic Commission for Africa, we've had two women, and now we have a man. And essentially those young ladies have all gone back now to become, leaders. One of them is at the IMF doing a very good job, but also now somebody's securing herself and a big leader. One of them has gone back to her country and is working in the Ministry of Finance. But I think it's that kind of ensuring that you pick and pull, young ladies like yourself up. We launched a young professionals program at the Economic Commission for Africa. We took 20 young professionals, 10 women, or maybe even 12 women and 8 men. So I think that's the way you do it. You just have to, make sure that you're on it all the time. We're also very fortunate that the UN, because our Secretary General is very keen on ensuring that there is parity in the system. So at the Undersecretary General level, for example, we have 50% of the Undersecretary Generals are women. And so it makes it easy in that kind of an environment to keep continuing to hire women. What I am doing is doing precisely that. I'm bringing a lot more women up through the ranks. I think one of the mistakes that institutions tend to make is that you bring women at the top, but there's no women through the system. And so we need to sort of just make sure that there's women at every level of that system that can continue to grow. We are about to launch, I think for 2021, our Young Professionals Program. So anybody that is listening that wants to come, actually, I think even in the next 2 weeks, we're going to launch a 3-month macroeconomics hiring spree where we're looking for about 10 people to come in with solid macroeconomic, econometrics backgrounds and policy analysis backgrounds. So I think if you're interested in policy analysis, trade, come and look at our webpage in the next week, and you can do 3 months of collaboration with the Economic Commission for Africa. We would, of course, be looking for 50% women. So there you go.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Songwe. In less than 30 minutes, you took us through the plan, the health plan, the financial plan, how Africa is working with the debt servicing, and you gave us professional advice. We're really grateful for that. We have questions already in the chat, so I will read them. Okay. So Sierra asks, based on World Bank simulation analysis against a 5-month school closure period, there could be permanent learning losses and an estimated $10 trillion in losses of potential earnings since school closures in many African countries persisted for longer and remote learning was even more inequitable than access to in-person learning. A more pessimistic, how is securing financing for education part of the discussions?
Look, I think that one thing that the crisis has shown us is that we were not equipped digitally. We've had a lot of conversations about Africa being leapfrogging in digital technology. I think the crisis has brought us a little bit closer to reality than we anticipated. We at the Economic Commission for Africa launched something called the African Communications and Information Platform, ACIP. And initially the idea then was that, you know, and this Shanta would like this a little bit, not a lot, Professor Shanta. You know, Africa has a lot of there's a lot of informal labor on the continent. And so the informal labor, the people who work in the informal systems are the ones who become the most vulnerable when you have crises like this, because they have no fallbacks, they have no social protection systems, they have no insurance systems to catch them. And so we thought, let's find out, you know, a way of reaching them. So we brought together the 7 largest telco companies on the continent, thinking, okay, if we bring all the telco companies together, we can actually reach many of these people very easily. We were able to get together 714 million phone numbers. We don't say people because some people have more than one. However, only 18% of that 714 actually are Android phones, which means they have access to the internet. So initially the idea was that we were going to be able to send out messages and do all this sophisticated thing on Android phones, but we ended up just sending out SMS codes and they have to send us, you know, we can still communicate with them, and we hope that we can improve that. But I think that shows that, you know, first of all, technology is still very, very limited on the continent. Exactly that question. 330 million African kids in primary and secondary school, half of them, or maybe 2/3 of them, do not have access to the internet. In any household, you are sitting in Washington, D.C., you know, if you're in a household of 4, everybody can get on the internet at the same time and you still have the same speed. On the continent, you have probably one connection and the speed is much, much slower. So I think one of the things that COVID will do, particularly for education, is accentuate the inequalities. And so what we're trying to do is see, one, can we improve on that? The World Bank has done a lot of work, says you need about $60 billion to improve on the digital ID, digital connectivity. And so we are working, we at the Economic Commission for Africa with the African Union, we wrote the sort of African digital strategy, and we're hoping that we can take that forward and now see how we move into implementation. With the AC program, we're also launching an artificial intelligence. We're working with the government of Congo to launch an artificial intelligence center or school. So if anybody wants to come and spend 3-6 months in Africa on artificial intelligence in the Republic of Congo, you're also welcome to come under the ECA program.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question. Rafael asks, do you think DFIs are doing enough at the moment in Africa? How do you think bilateral DFIs can leverage more on the private sector to provide development?
Do I think they're doing enough? I think the person who asked the question, by the time they said, do you think, the answer is always no, right? We always want them to do more. I have to say that many DFIs have leaned forward during this crisis. You know, CDC in the UK, GIZ, KfW in Germany, the IFC, have all tried to, you know, extend a little bit more trade liquidity, a little bit more trade finance, some working capital to the real sectors to see what we can do and how they can do better. But I think that's one of the things that's one of our asks for the special drawing rights, is that some of the DFIs get more capitalized because they don't have sufficient resources to actually lean forward during the crisis. But for some DFIs, it's not so much that they need more resources, but it's the cost of financing, which is quite prohibitive for the private sector as well. And so we need, you know, a small and medium enterprise or micro enterprise woman cannot take out loans from DFIs at, you know, the kinds of rates that we sometimes see. So we need some de-risking, some blending to make the cost of DFI money a little bit cheaper so that they can actually do more on the continent.
And this question takes us back to the health point of view. Neha would like to know, she says, since the vaccine is mRNA based and there are few lingering questions about stability of product and the extreme cold conditions that it requires, how will Africa handle the logistics for the vaccine delivery across the continent?
That's a very good question. One of the things that we did, again, at the Economic Commission for Africa, but working with Afreximbank, with ECONET and the African Union, was before COVID happened, we were actually working on a pharmaceutical initiative for Africa. We wanted Africa to produce more pharmaceutical drugs on the continent. And essentially, we realized that we were importing $14.7 billion worth of drugs, almost 70-something% of all the drugs on the continent that we consume are imported. And so we were beginning to work on a drugs initiative. Then COVID hit. And so we created this African Medical Supplies platform. On the African Medical Supplies platform, and that's one of the reasons you probably didn't hear about Africa lacking test kits or PPEs and all that stuff, because we were able to create a platform where there was full supply for everybody who needed it, and you could actually buy it off of this platform. Now, when the vaccination conversation began, we started thinking about the vaccination conversation, and I just came from that. And that question is an interesting one because, yes, the two vaccines so far that we're all talking about are the ones that need, I think, is it some minus 70 degrees of cold chain storage for them to be able to work. Oh my God, Africa, we don't have that kind of stuff, right? And so it costs about we have anticipated that it will cost almost $2.3 billion for the logistics of that kind of a vaccine chain. So there's a lot of work now. We actually have a working group that has been put together. We meet in the evenings. We call it our third shift. And we sort of try to think about how we can do that logistics. Of course, there's the COVAX facility that has been created to fund some of the vaccines. The World Bank has put together $12 billion on the vaccines, but most of them are not looking at the logistics yet. So we're also trying to see whether African development financial institutions, by the way, that's an answer to your question, can maybe chip in the logistics part, but also it's a business, and you see we can sort of maybe develop a business around that process. So that's what we're looking at, and that's what we're thinking that we want to do.
Okay, thank you. Also, like the questions are coming in really fast, so I'm not the one who's throwing them at you like that.
I can see some of them coming in, yeah.
Okay, so
the intermediary.
So Nonso would like to talk about the AfCFTA and national politics. And this is very interesting because we know that the Nigerian border I'm not sure if it's still closed or not, even though it has signed its agreement. So how do you intend to, how does the Commission intend to deal with national politics like that, where governments can decide all of a sudden to close their borders?
I must say that we as the Economic Commission for Africa feel very proud that Nigeria has finally come around, because we have done a lot of work with Nigeria. We have done quite a number of seminars working with the Nigerian Manufacturers Association, working with the big businesses in Nigeria, and getting a lot of support from, you know, Aliko Dangote, Tony, and many others, trying to see whether we can convince the rest of Nigeria, and particularly Nigeria's political systems, that the CFTA was a good idea. I think that Nigeria has always been convinced that the CFTA was a good idea, but Nigeria is one of the largest manufacturing countries on the continent. So they needed to take the time that it was needed, one, to consult with their private sector so that they ensure that, you know, with the CFTA, there are going to be some winners and some losers. There's going to be some adjustments. There's going to be more competition, which is what we want. And we want to create more jobs. But that also means that some people are going to lose, right? Creative destruction. And so I think Nigeria needed to talk through its systems to get to a place where there was more consensus on adopting the CFTA. So we're very, very happy that Nigeria has finally joined the CFTA, because I think we could have never really spoken about a CFTA in earnest without the second largest economy on our continent being a part of it. One of the big issues on the CFTA is the rules of origin. And that's why Nigeria has its borders closed, essentially because if you don't have the right rules of origin, things can come from outside the continent into Nigeria's borders and then end up in Nigeria in the name of CFTA without paying any taxes. So Nigeria needed to ensure that the overall African, trade community had put in place the right rules of origins, and that these countries were able to monitor their markets in such a way that there will not be a lot of smuggling and leakage into Nigeria. So I think today some of those rules and regulations are in place. We're still finalizing the full rules of origins for the CFTA, but we've made, I think, a very good effort with Nigeria's help, of course. South Africa and many of the sort of more industrial countries need that we have the right rules of origin, or otherwise, things could come from China, they could come from India, and then spend 3 days in Togo and then get into Nigeria in the name of CFTA. And that's not what we want on the continent. We want manufacturing, we want production on the continent, not, imported goods being traded as African, made in Africa.
I don't know if to quickly sneak in my question because I have the mic, or so because you said that you're trying to make sure that goods are produced within the continent. I know that part of a problem that people have brought up about the Trade Act is the fact that a lot of countries do not even trade with themselves within Africa. So how do you intend to ensure that countries actually trade with themselves? I'm not sure, but I think the country that had the highest percentage of African goods was Botswana or something, I'm not sure. So how do you ensure that these other countries like South Africa and Nigeria that have big economies actually trade with other countries in Africa? And the second leg to that question is because you talked about competition. And I'm wondering, I know economically it seems almost impossible, but what happens when competition becomes the smaller countries get to suffer because the competition is not fair to them? And how does the Commission intend to protect small countries from undue competitive strategies?
No, and thank you. I think that's it's a two-part question, and both parts are very good. Let me start with the second part. I think one of the things that we have been trying to explain to many countries, and part of it is by doing solid analytical work and looking at sort of labor market conditions and global competitiveness policies, pricing policies, and regulation, is actually that the smaller countries stand to benefit more from the CFTA. Of course, it's not comparables 100%, but if you look at I like to use this example, and I was actually using it the other day with the ambassador of Ireland to Ethiopia. Ireland used to be a fragile and conflict-affected country in Europe, right? And they were able to, in a space of 20 years, go from a fragile and conflict-affected country to one of the countries with the highest growth. Some years they grow at 26%, because they were in the European Union and they were able to benefit from having access to such a large market. Another example is Denmark, neighboring Germany, right? They're not a huge economy, but they've been able to benefit from R&D. They've been able to benefit from the proximity of a large economy to actually stabilize and do much better. And I think that that's what we tell the smaller African countries, is that actually you stand to benefit more, because the adjustment that you need is one much smaller, but it's also easier to put in place. If you go to Nigeria today and you try to get all the lawyers together to agree on a sort of dispute resolution settlement systems, I mean, it's going to be a nightmare. But you can do that very easily in Benin or Togo. So if you're a foreign company that came and set shop in Benin or Togo, you could be exporting to Nigeria every morning without having to deal with dispute resolution systems in Nigeria. And I think those are some of the things that can benefit the smaller countries. In addition to that, and you're right, this is not to say that there wouldn't be, like I said, you must have some destructive processes to be able to create and to be able to have some innovation. And this is what we want. We want competition. We don't want protection, right? And you know, and that's the conversation that we were having with the ministers today, is for how long do you need to protect your industries and not open them to the CFTA or to trade? And we know that, you know, infant industry protection works for a while, after which, you know, essentially it's just a subsidy, it's a negative subsidy that is bringing down the economy, and we should change that. What the ECA has been doing is we've completed about 20 national competitiveness strategies. So we're working with countries to say, where is it that you will benefit the most from the CFTA? What areas of your economy do you need to develop? And so maybe this is going to push us towards more diversification, which is something that Africa has not succeeded in doing well for a very long time, right? So there's a lot of that work. We're doing some analytical work to see. And it's not just how you can be competitive as an economy, but how you can be competitive in a regional supply chain. It's very, very important. The whole point around the CFTA is not just that the economy is competitive, but that you're competitive in a value chain. That, you know, and let's take, for example, cotton, you know, that Mali and Niger produce cotton, that it is ginned in Ghana, and then, you know, the textiles or the jeans are created in Ethiopia and then exported. And that's a value chain. And we want that value chain. We want at least a few nodes of that value chain, which create jobs, which create additional innovation, and to happen on the continent before we get to the export stage. So that is really the end goal of the CFTA, is to see whether we can also create global value chains that then eventually can connect to the, you know, more regional value chains that can connect to the global value chains. Now, on the first part of your question, I think two things. Africa does not trade a lot with itself. Africa does not trade a lot with the world, where Africa is 17% of the world's population. We're 2% of the world's exports. The way I put it in is rather crude, and sometimes people don't like to hear this, is I say that we believe that we're only 2% smart. If it's only 2%, if we only trade 2%, it means that it's only 2% of what we produce that anybody cares about. And actually of the 2%, 1% is just rocks that we dig and send out. So we're maybe only 1% smart. So we need a lot more innovation. We need to be a lot more creative, but that requires also that we should protect our innovations in a way that, you know, because as the next sort of big commodity is going to be the brain and technology and new creations that come out on e-commerce systems. And we must find property rights systems that can protect those innovations, because if we don't, then, you know, again, we will create value on the continent, which will actually be assessed and sold outside of the continent at different rates. And so I think that that's what we need to start trying to do, is to see how can we ensure that, particularly in the service sector, in the digital sector, we create a system. Today, most of the patents actually for innovation that are registered on the continent are registered by foreigners. And so I usually say that when Google comes to Africa and runs a Google competition, they get 2 or 3 great ideas, and they come and they IPO it in a company in Silicon Valley, and that company becomes a $10 billion company. The country in Africa where they got the idea is a $1 billion economy. So we need to be able to protect that. But at the same time, we need, of course, to build more human capacity. We need to change our curriculums. One of the things that we at the ECA are pushing is more STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and math, so that particularly for young girls, that they can go into that and do programming and be as innovative as they can be. I think the other thing with intra-African trade has been that we're trading the same things. So, you know, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon, and you know, we're all trading cocoa. We can't be buying each other's cocoa. So we need to do something different. And I think, again, this is where this diversification conversation starts happening. If we can diversify our economies a little bit more, or, you know, get to this afternoon, we were talking with the president of Niger, who was saying, I have, you know, I give a statistic that I gave this afternoon, 49 million cows in Africa, 9 million cows in the United States. The United States produces 19 times more milk than we do in Africa. We just are not there yet, you know, in terms of industrialization, in terms of processing. And the president of Niger then picked on my example to say, but, you know, we could do milk in Niger, and Ivory Coast will do chocolat au lait. How do you say chocolat au lait? Milk with chocolates, or chocolates with milk. And so they will take our milk, they'll do the chocolates, and they will import it. And that's the CFTA in action. But, you know, Cote d'Ivoire is not processing cocoa, and Niger is not processing milk. So you don't get to the point of the CFTA. But I think that's where we need to get to. And when we talk about diversification, industrialization. That's really what we mean, is to see how we can create more value for supply chains that already exist on the continent, but still exist at the very primary level.
Okay. There are so many questions, but I think one question that I wanted to ask with regards to, and everybody, a lot of people in the chat have also mentioned it, is how the Trade Act, how the trade agreement will affect the average African. So what's it going to be for small businesses? Are they going to feel the trickle-down effect? How long do you envisage it to take?
I think we also should be realistic and what's the word? Yes, well, realistic. So the CFTA, like NAFTA, like the EU, when the EU got into its trade agreement, it was not going to happen overnight. It's going to be an incremental process, I think, where we're going to be seeing the benefits. You will see, countries will see as much benefit as they put in. Right? If they put in place the right regulations, if they put in place the right infrastructure, if they put in place, then they will be the first to attract that FDI that is needed. And the FDI doesn't need necessarily to come from Europe. It can just be, Rwandans going to Kenya. It could be Angolans going to Mozambique or South Africa. So again, we will begin to create clusters on the continent that will work. Now, what does this mean for small and medium enterprises? A lot of the cross-border trade on the continent is done by women. Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, that sort of West African axis in some sense. If you look at it just as one example, it's a lot of women who do business on that stretch of the economy. What the CFTA is going to do is we're going to harmonize border controls. We're going to take away non-transparent customs processes. We're going to make it more fluid. You wouldn't need to stop at every border because you will have one border control system. We would actually, for some commodities, take away the tariffs, so you wouldn't even need to stop at all. That's what it's going to do. It's going to facilitate businesses in this sort of, transcontinental borders, West Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa. We believe that that's really what if the CFTA works well, the CFTA really should benefit the most the small and medium enterprises. Of course, behind the CFTA, we need to find structures for financing to ensure that, those small and medium enterprise businesses have access to the right kinds of finance that they need. But my sense is, and I think whoever asked the question is right, we have not, as institutions, and I'll be the first to own up, we've spent a lot of time working on what are the rules of origin, what's the dispute settlement, what are your tariff offers, and we haven't really, I think, started the process of socializing what the CFTA will mean to the small and medium enterprise, what the CFTA will mean to the small business. I think it's just now, and we just finished African Industrialization Week, and it's just now we're realizing there's a sort of Afro Champions private sector group that is meeting, and we were thinking, but a lot of the businesses are still saying, what does this mean for me? What's in it for me? Because I think because it has been a regulatory agenda, it's been mostly in the hands of the state and the ministers. But I think we're now beginning, and thanks to COVID, if one may say that, we've done a lot of work with the pharmaceutical sector, and the pharmaceutical sector is now talking to others. So for example, in the pharmaceutical sector, Egypt was producing drugs, but they couldn't sell them to the rest of the continent because there was no harmonization. So they had drugs that were going to waste, but Seychelles was buying the same drugs at 20 times the price because it's a small economy and nobody wants to go sell there. So now we're trying to begin to see whether we can harmonize this, and ECA is launching a sort of Horn of Africa pharmaceutical pool procurement pharmaceutical initiative to see how we can then begin to open these markets, but also teach people and educate people on how the CFTA works and what it's actually doing and what it means for small and medium enterprises. But we need to do more. We need to do more.
Okay. We have questions from Malaki, Dr. Soji, Professor Shenge, and I will put them all in one question and try to summarize. So a lot of these questions are asking about how, since a lot of times the problem with development in Africa is incompetent governance, but you have a situation where you have people who are willing. And Dr. Soji specifically mentions the agricultural sector. And so they're asking about how we can stir up regional approaches to assist initiatives already being brought up by organizations like the ECA, by commissions like the ECA?
I think, we have our good points and we have our not so good points, and then we have our terrible points. Governance is one of those areas where we are not doing well and we're struggling and we continue to struggle. But we hope that, if we actually embraced technology in the way in which we are all talking about it, maybe that will help us to provide a little bit more transparency. Now, one of my champions since the COVID started is somebody called Kenneth Odede from Kenya. I don't know if there's any East Africans on the line, but Kenneth Odede runs the Kibera NGO in the slums. And I remember him saying, why are you asking me to buy a mask when I cannot buy bread? And I read in the newspapers every day that my government has gotten money from the World Bank, which I will never see. And so he started this movement around, what the kind of transparency that citizens need. And we saw in South Africa recently the issue. So I think that with the advent of technology, with the advent of the internet, people are a little bit more aware, and this goes back to the debt conversation, right? People are a little bit more aware of resources coming into their governments and are willing and more ready to ask for more accountability. But we haven't found yet, or we haven't been willing, because I think we know what it is. We just have not been willing to put in place the systems to demand more transparency. And I think we will need to do a lot more on that. But my sense is also that as citizens, all of us have a responsibility in that process. It's not sort of the ECA is going to go and do it, or it's all of us as citizens. Of course, we at the ECA will put in place, and we just released a report, by the way, on the institutions that are needed in Africa to stop illicit financial flows. And what you see actually is that on the continent, we don't have many countries that have the right institutions, even for illicit financial flows, despite how much we talk about it. So I think there is still the need. It's not for institutional capacity building. It's not about capacity building. It's about the will, the political will to set up the institution and to fund it well. If you're from Nigeria, you would remember Nuhu Rubadu and the EFCC of the day. What happened to that EFCC? Today it's become sort of the, an additional, I don't know, I speak under the control of the Nigerians, but, it's not as powerful as it used to be when it was initially created. And I think that's where we are failing. There is no political will to do the right things. And I think we do need to do better in the space of governance on the continent. But I think we have the instruments now. We have the instruments in the hands of civil society. And we hopefully, with the ECA, we're working with OGP, the Open Governance Government Platform. Sanjay knows, Shanta knows with Sanjay Pradhan. We actually had a meeting 2-3 days ago with Professor Mbeki, to see how we can push the governance political space on the continent.
Okay. Thank you for this wonderful conversation, Dr. Songwe. I would love to continue, but we told everybody it will be for an hour, so I wouldn't like to go past that. I would like to say thank you to Dr. Songwe for this wonderful conversation, to my professors, Professor Frank and Professor Shanta, who have been here since the beginning. I don't know if you'd like to say anything or if you just want to. Professor Shanta, your mic is muted.
Famous last words in the age of COVID.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. That's me.
Okay, hi. Just to say, it's been a real pleasure seeing and listening to Vera. This was a great conversation, and I'm really, really delighted you were able to do this. And congratulations to the Africa group for organizing this.
Thank you for having me, Shanta. Thank you. It was fun. It was fun. Thank you.
Thank you also to my board members, to the team from ECA. You've been very wonderful. And to my guests, thank you for coming. I'd like to see you guys some other time. Thank you, everybody.
You're all welcome. You're all invited to the Economic Commission for Africa. Like I said, we have a couple of internships. Very happy to have you come and work with us. In the age of COVID, you don't even have to come to Ethiopia, even though Ethiopia is a beautiful place to come to, but you can work from a distance. So I think it would be nice to see how with Shanta, maybe we can devise something to have a collaboration with you. But it will be our pleasure. And I thank my team as well for doing this. They was panicking. They're like, Vera, you have to join now. You have to join now.
No, thank you. Also, my other professor, Professor Frank, just texted me to say thank you to you for having us
I
here.
can't see Professor Frank. Maybe he should just show up on the screen so at least I'll get some visual of who Professor Frank is. But thank you as well.
I just wanted to say thank you as well to Vera. This was very helpful, and again, congratulations to Ebele and your colleagues in Africa. This is a fantastic event. Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you, Ebele. Let's end on time. It's exactly 10 o'clock. Thank you. Good night. Be safe. Mask, hand washing. Thank you.
Thank you.